The cradle of Europe did not rise with Athens. It burned first in Crete, a kingdom of labyrinths and painted walls, where bulls flew in frescoes and priestesses ruled in silence, vanished in a single convulsion. Not war, not conquest, fire from the sea. A mountain tore itself apart on Thera, an explosion so violent it split the sky, hurled waves taller than palaces, and smothered cities beneath falling ash. Entire harbors drowned, trade collapsed, temples shattered, a civilization erased while its memory still throbbed in the veins of those who survived. And yet, it never truly died. Centuries later, Plato whispered of an island empire, radiant with wealth, drowned in a single day of wrath. Was it fable? Was it warning? Or was it the echo of that night when the Minoan world choked on smoke and saltwater? The lines blur, history bleeding into myth, myth into prophecy. Beneath every stone of Knossos, beneath every ash-packed ruin of Akrotiri, something trembles, something half-remembered, half-buried, refusing to stay silent. Atlantis is not a dream. It is a scar, and the scar still bleeds. The island of Crete rises out of the Aegean like a stone caught between three continents. To the north lies mainland Greece, to the south the deserts of Egypt, and to the east the great kingdoms of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. It is here, around 3000 BCE, that a society took shape whose sophistication would earn it the title of Europe's first advanced civilization. The world now calls them the Minoans, though they left no name for themselves that we can read. Their voices remain locked in clay tablets scratched with a script still silent. Linear A. Undeciphered despite more than a century of effort. What survives instead are their buildings, their art, and their ruins, speaking with a clarity sharper than words. Crete's earliest settlements trace back to Neolithic farmers, people who arrived centuries before 7000 BCE, bringing with them wheat, barley, and domesticated animals. They lived in villages of mud brick and stone, shaping a quiet existence in fertile valleys, watered by streams that cut through rugged mountains. By 3000 BCE, these scattered communities had grown into something far more ambitious. Bronze replaced stone tools, trade routes stretched across the sea, and agriculture supported larger populations. The island's location, at the center of Aegean waters and facing outward to Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levant, made it a crossroads. Geography gave Crete an advantage, and its people seized it with a force that would transform the island into the beating heart of the Bronze Age Aegean. What rose on Crete in the centuries that followed was extraordinary. The first palatial complexes appeared around 2000 BCE, massive architectural centers at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. These were not castles in the sense of fortresses. They lacked defensive walls, unlike the citadels of the Mycenaeans on the mainland. Instead, they stood open, sprawling, layered with storerooms, courtyards, staircases, and shrines. At Knossos, the largest of them all, corridors wound in such complexity that later Greek legend would transform the site into the labyrinth of King Minos. Inside, enormous storage rooms held giant pithoi, jars taller than a man, filled with olive oil, wine, and grain. The palace was both a warehouse and a center of power, managing agriculture, redistribution, and religious rituals. The sheer scale suggests centralized authority, yet the exact nature of Minoan governance remains uncertain. Kings, queens, priestly elites, all are possible, but the ruins speak only in shadows. The art of the Minoans gives clearer testimony. Frescoes painted on the walls of Knossos, Akrotiri, and Phaistos burst with images of lilies, dolphins, and athletes vaulting over charging bulls. These were not idle decorations but reflections of a society that drew strength from ritual and symbolism. The bull became central, sacred, powerful, dangerous, appearing on seals, frescoes, and myth. Some frescoes show young men and women grasping horns, flipping through the air in acrobatic displays, acts that seem as much ceremonial as athletic. Women appear prominently in Minoan art, often dressed in elaborate flounced skirts, bare-breasted, standing in postures of authority. Scholars debate their role, whether priestesses, queens, or both, but their presence underscores a striking contrast with many later patriarchal cultures of the Mediterranean. This culture thrived not in isolation but in connection. Archaeological finds reveal Minoan trade links that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. Crete's ships carried pottery, textiles, and oil to the ports of Egypt and the Levant, returning with copper, ivory, and precious stones. In Egyptian tomb paintings of the 15th century BCE, figures identifiable as Minoans bring offerings of metal vessels and finely worked objects. The Aegean was their highway, and mastery of the sea sustained their prosperity. Some scholars speak of a thalassocracy, a maritime power that dominated through trade rather than war. Yet even as trade carried wealth, writing recorded its flow. Around 1900 BCE, the Minoans developed Linear A, a script written on clay tablets and ceilings. It remains undeciphered, but its form shows it was used for administrative records, accounts of goods, inventories, exchanges. These fragments reveal a bureaucracy both sophisticated and extensive, yet the absence of readable texts denies historians the voices of those who governed. What survives are lists without names, numbers without narrative. The living thoughts of the Minoans remain beyond reach. The architecture of Crete demonstrates technical brilliance. Multi-story buildings rose with wooden columns painted red, light wells illuminating inner chambers, staircases spiraling upward in careful design. Drainage systems carried water through terracotta pipes, and at Knossos, bathrooms with flushing mechanisms predate similar inventions elsewhere by centuries. This was not a people fumbling in the dawn of history, but one pushing the boundaries of engineering and organization. Archaeological excavations began in earnest at the turn of the 20th century. Sir Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist who uncovered Knossos in 1900, brought the Minoans into modern historical consciousness. His reconstructions, controversial for their interpretive leaps, nonetheless revealed the scale of a culture that had been forgotten for 3 millennia. He gave them the name Minoans, linking them to the legendary king Minos of later Greek myth. Though no proof ties the name to the people themselves, it has endured. The myths of the Minotaur, the labyrinth, and the bull all seem to echo in the ruins Evans uncovered. The overlap between myth and archaeology has haunted interpretations ever since. By 1700 BCE, the palaces had grown even more complex after initial destructions and reconstructions. Knossos expanded to cover nearly 20,000 square meters, a vast administrative and religious hub. It oversaw a landscape of villages, farms, and workshops. The island's population may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands, sustained by fertile plains and organized storage. Minoan pottery, with its flowing marine motifs, octopuses, shells, and waves, circulated across the Aegean, leaving traces as far as the Levantine coast. The absence of fortifications across Crete has long puzzled historians. Unlike the Mycenaean citadels of Tiryns or Mycenae, Minoan palaces stood undefended, their walls open. Some argue this reflects a society confident in its maritime control, protected by the sea and by fleets. Others suggest an ideology of openness, a preference for religious or economic display over military might. Whatever the reason, the architecture reflects priorities distinct from their mainland neighbors. Linear A, despite its silence, marks one of the civilization's most enduring mysteries. Unlike Linear B, its later adaptation by the Mycenaeans, it refuses to yield meaning. Tablets cataloging sheep, oil, and grain speak in numbers, but the names of deities, officials, or rulers remain impenetrable. Decades of scholarship, comparisons with known languages, and digital analysis have yet to crack its code. Each inscription remains a locked chamber in the labyrinth of history. The archaeological sites themselves speak in layers. At Akrotiri, on the island of Thera, Santorini, excavations have revealed a town preserved beneath volcanic ash, its frescoes intact, its streets laid with stone, its houses furnished with multiple stories. The site shows the reach of Minoan culture beyond Crete itself, projecting its influence into the Cyclades. Akrotiri froze a moment of Minoan life. Frescoes of ships in procession, fishermen carrying their catch, monkeys imported from far-off lands, all preserved by catastrophe. By 1450 BCE, this world would collapse, but in its rise, the Minoan civilization shaped the trajectory of the Aegean. Theirs was a society that built without walls, traded across seas, painted their palaces with life, and left a script no one can read. They stand at the threshold of history, visible in stone and fresco, yet elusive in voice and meaning. Crete was not a periphery. It was a center, a force, a presence that set the stage for everything that followed in the Mediterranean Bronze Age. The Minoan world was not a kingdom of soldiers and fortresses, but of palaces that towered above valleys and harbors, sprawling in complexity, both administrative centers and ritual landscapes. At Knossos, the largest and most enduring of them all, the architecture stretched across nearly 20,000 square meters by the height of its power around 1700 to 1450 BCE. Corridors twisted into one another, staircases spiraled upward, light wells pierced the interior, and storerooms lined with rows of giant pithoi, storage jars capable of holding hundreds of liters, spoke of a system built to control agriculture and redistribution on a massive scale. This was not chaos. It was bureaucracy carved in stone. Grain, olive oil, and wine were not left scattered across villages but gathered, measured, sealed, and stored under the watch of palace officials. From these storerooms, the wealth of Crete was managed, and with it, the authority of those who presided within the palaces. The power of the Minoan elite was reinforced not by walls of stone, but by the circulation of goods and the language of art. The frescoes that survived on the plastered walls of Knossos, Akrotiri, and Phaistos did not glorify kings with weapons or conquests. They poured life into scenes of dolphins swimming across blue surfaces, lilies opening into bloom, and youths vaulting over charging bulls in mid-flight. These were not idle decorations. They carried meaning. The dolphins spoke of the sea that sustained Minoan power. The lilies marked the rhythms of seasons and fertility. The bulls stood as emblems of strength and ritual, recurring again and again as if demanding constant recognition. The famous bull-leaping frescoes, depicting acrobats grasping horns and somersaulting over the backs of massive animals, reveal more than spectacle. They embody the relationship between human, animal, and divinity, a performance that bound community to ritual and ritual to power. Religious symbolism in Minoan art was dominated by female figures. Frescoes, figurines, and seal stones depict women in elaborate attire, often holding snakes or flanked by animals, their arms raised in gestures of command. These figures, sometimes called snake goddesses, suggest that female divinities or priestesses stood at the center of worship. Shrines found within palaces contained cult symbols, horns of consecration, double axes, labyrinths, and figurines, pointing to a system where religion was not separate from authority but its foundation. The prevalence of women in positions of ritual prominence has led many scholars to argue that Minoan society granted unusual visibility to female roles, whether in cult, administration, or both. The central courtyards of the palaces, vast open spaces framed by colonnades, were likely the stage for ceremonies witnessed by large audiences, moments when society gathered in collective recognition of divine order. The palaces themselves were structured not only for ritual but for administration. Linear inscriptions, though undeciphered, clearly indicate record-keeping. Clay tablets preserve lists of goods, quantities of livestock, allocations of agricultural produce. Seal impressions on clay nodules, stamped with intricate designs, marked ownership, authorization, and the passage of commodities. The Minoans built systems to count, record, and redistribute, a framework of order that stretched across the island. The palaces stood as the nodes of this network, coordinating trade, production, and worship. Authority was sustained not by visible military might but by control of resources, ritual legitimacy, and mastery of the seas. That mastery of the seas is among the most striking features of the Minoan world. The island's location made it a natural bridge across the eastern Mediterranean, and the evidence of trade is overwhelming. Cretan pottery has been uncovered in the Cyclades, on the Greek mainland, along the coast of Anatolia, and in the Levant. In Egypt, tomb paintings from the reign of Thutmose III in the mid-15th century BCE show men bringing gifts, metal vessels, ornate objects, dressed in garments consistent with Minoan style. The direction of trade is clear. Minoan ships carried oil, wine, and crafted goods outward and returned with copper from Cyprus, ivory from Syria, and gold from Egypt. It was a circuit that made Crete one of the wealthiest powers of the Bronze Age Aegean. The sea was not only a trade route but also a defense. Unlike the Mycenaean citadels, Minoan palaces were not fortified with massive walls. Their power rested on fleets, on the ability to control maritime corridors, and perhaps on alliances sustained through trade itself. The absence of fortifications suggests either confidence in naval supremacy or a society whose ideology emphasized openness rather than war. Thucydides, writing in the 5th century BCE, credited King Minos with creating the first naval empire in Greek tradition, a thalassocracy. Whether or not the tradition reflects historical truth, the archaeological record supports the image of Crete as a naval power, commanding routes across the Aegean. Every detail of Minoan culture reveals a society that expressed authority differently from the kingdoms around it. Where Mesopotamian rulers carved images of conquests in stone, the Minoans painted athletes vaulting over bulls. Where Egyptian temples aligned with cosmic order and celebrated pharaohs as gods, Minoan sanctuaries presented goddess figures, horned altars, and communal courtyards. Where Mycenaean Greece fortified citadels against attack, Crete built open palaces with water systems, storage complexes, and art that celebrated nature. These contrasts underscore the uniqueness of the Minoan experiment in statehood. The complexity of their storage systems alone testifies to administrative sophistication. At Knossos, rows of magazines contained hundreds of giant storage jars, many capable of holding up to 200 liters. The sheer volume points to a centralized economy capable of redistributing vast surpluses, ensuring both stability and authority. The palace was at once a temple, a government center, and a warehouse, its functions inseparable. Control of storage meant control of food, oil, and resources, the foundation of political power. The reach of Minoan culture extended even further than material goods. Artistic motifs spread across the Aegean, shaping Cycladic and mainland traditions. Marine-style pottery, with flowing depictions of octopuses, fish, and seaweed, reflects both aesthetic innovation and symbolic attachment to the sea. At Akrotiri on Thera, frescoes show ships in procession, harbors bustling with activity, proof of Minoan influence far beyond Crete. The island's fleets stitched together a cultural network across the Aegean, weaving art, ritual, and trade into a single fabric. Yet, for all their sophistication, the Minoans remain elusive. Linear A refuses interpretation, withholding names, titles, and prayers. Their religion, visible in fragments, figurines, frescoes, sanctuaries on mountain peaks and in caves, offers images without words. The central role of goddesses, the symbolism of bulls, the prominence of ritual gestures, all point to a system of belief that infused every aspect of life. Yet its precise theology remains beyond reach. Archaeologists reconstruct only pieces. Sacred horns mounted on palace roofs, double axes etched into stone, figurines clasping serpents, shrines on mountain peaks where offerings of clay figurines and weapons lay buried in soil. The weight of their presence still presses through the ruins. The palaces were not mere structures but living systems, administrative engines, ritual theaters, and maritime headquarters. Their frescoes, vivid even after millennia, pulse with energy, color, and meaning. Their ships, though vanished, left trails across the Mediterranean, embedding Cretan influence from Cyprus to the Nile. The Minoan world was built upon architecture, ritual, art, and sea power, each inseparable from the other, each sustaining a civilization that rose in brilliance on the edge of 3 continents. Bronze was the lifeblood of the 2nd millennium BCE, the alloy that shaped weapons, tools, and symbols of authority. To create it required copper and tin, resources never found together in abundance, demanding networks that stretched across seas and continents. Crete, with its harbors open to the Aegean and its fleets tracing the coasts of Anatolia, Cyprus, and beyond, stood at the intersection of this economy. The Minoans, thriving between 2000 and 1500 BCE, positioned themselves not as conquerors but as mediators, controlling the flow of raw materials that sustained the entire Bronze Age. From the copper mines of Cyprus and the tin sources as far as Central Asia or Anatolia, goods traveled into Cretan storerooms to be worked by artisans and shipped outward again. Their workshops produced daggers with gilded hilts, swords with inlaid designs, and tools that spread across the Mediterranean, carrying with them not only metal but style, technique, and identity. This power did not rest solely on material exchange. The Minoans absorbed and transmitted culture. From Egypt, they drew motifs, technologies, and luxury goods, while in return offering crafted objects that found their way into the tombs of pharaohs. In the tomb of Rekhmire, vizier of Thutmose III in the 15th century BCE, paintings depict men with short kilts and flounced garments, clearly Minoan in style, bearing gifts of vessels and artifacts. They were recognized as representatives of a distant but significant power. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans adopted Minoan symbols, writing, and artistic forms. Linear B, the Mycenaean script, derived directly from Minoan Linear A, reshaped for the Greek language. The famous Mycenaean shaft graves of Grave Circle A at Mycenae, 16th century BCE, contain weapons and ornaments reflecting Minoan craftsmanship. Daggers with elaborate scenes of lions hunting gazelle, gold masks, and vessels of Cretan style. Crete transmitted an aesthetic, a language of power, and a system of administration that mainland Greece would inherit and adapt. The political structure that orchestrated this vast web remains one of the most debated subjects in Aegean history. The scale of the palaces, Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, Zakros, suggests centralized authority, but the form it took is elusive. Some scholars argue for kingship, pointing to the later Greek tradition of Minos, imagined as a ruler who commanded both law and sea. Others propose priestly rule, emphasizing the centrality of religious symbols, goddess figurines, and ritual architecture in palace complexes. Another view places power in the hands of an elite collective, families or lineages managing administration, trade, and cult together. The archaeological record is silent on titles. There are no readable inscriptions proclaiming kings or queens, no monumental stele naming rulers as in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Authority is instead inferred from the machinery of administration, storage magazines, ceilings, and records, pointing to hierarchy but not naming its faces. What is striking is how power manifested not in militarism but in control of resources and ritual. There are few depictions of warfare in Minoan art. No triumphal scenes of battles or sieges fill their frescoes. Instead, images of nature, bulls, processions, and ceremonies dominate. Some have taken this absence to suggest a relatively peaceful society, one shielded by its fleets rather than spears. The idea of a Minoan thalassocracy, a naval empire controlling the Aegean without needing land-based conquest, has deep roots. Thucydides, centuries later, credited Minos with ruling the seas and clearing piracy from the waters. While archaeology cannot confirm the full extent of such dominance, the absence of fortifications on Crete and the widespread reach of Minoan goods argue strongly for a system sustained by maritime influence rather than constant war. Yet even in this context, everyday life was far from simple. Farmers worked the fertile plains of Crete, cultivating wheat, barley, olives, and grapes. Herds of sheep and goats provided wool and meat. Linear A tablets, though undeciphered, clearly cataloged these resources, listing numbers of livestock and amounts of agricultural produce. The palace economy relied on these producers, drawing in surplus for redistribution. Artisans clustered around palatial centers, shaping pottery with marine motifs, chiseling stone seals with intricate designs, working ivory into figurines, and hammering bronze into blades and tools. The sophistication of their craft indicates not only technical skill but also sustained patronage from elites who demanded objects of refinement for ritual and prestige. Trade brought diversity into Minoan society. Ivory from Syria, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic, all have been found in Cretan contexts, testifying to far-reaching connections. These materials arrived in raw form, to be reworked by Minoan artisans into products that bore their distinctive style. pottery from Crete, with its fluid marine decorations, has been uncovered across the Aegean, testifying to demand for Cretan craft. The palaces themselves acted as both producers and distributors, sustaining networks that bound together distant lands through exchange. The influence of Minoan culture on later Greece cannot be overstated. Mycenaean palaces such as Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae adopted administrative systems inspired by Crete. Their use of linear B as a written script stems directly from Minoan innovations in record-keeping. Even religious traditions appear to echo Minoan origins. Goddesses of fertility, symbols of bulls, and ritual practices shaped aspects of Greek cult that endured into classical times. The myth of the labyrinth and the Minotaur reflects not only later storytelling but also the memory of Knossos and its bull-centered rituals, woven into Greek imagination centuries after the palaces had fallen silent. The stability of Minoan society, if measured by the longevity of its palaces, rested on the alignment of economy, religion, and maritime power. Farmers, artisans, administrators, and elites each had roles bound to the palace system. Wealth was not hoarded by one segment but circulated through a redistributive mechanism that provided food security, funded monumental architecture, and sustained religious festivals. Such cohesion, however, also meant vulnerability. The centralization that gave strength also concentrated risk. When disaster came, from eruption, earthquake, or invasion, the entire structure trembled. But in their prime, the Minoans stood apart. They were neither an empire like Egypt nor a kingdom like Babylon. They were something different, a society whose power rested on ships, trade, art, and ritual, binding together the Mediterranean in ways that later civilizations would inherit. Their wealth came not from conquest but from mediation, from standing at the crossroads of tin and copper, of east and west, of myth and history. Crete in the Bronze Age was more than an island. It was the engine of a world, its palaces humming with storage, its frescoes pulsing with ceremony, its harbors bristling with ships that carried both goods and culture across the sea. In the middle of the second millennium BCE, the Aegean world faced one of the greatest natural catastrophes ever recorded in human history. On the island of Thera, known today as Santorini, a volcano that had been building pressure for centuries erupted with a force so immense it tore the island apart. The exact date remains debated, with radiocarbon evidence suggesting around 1627 to 1600 BCE and archaeological synchronisms pointing closer to 1550 BCE. But the scale of the disaster is beyond dispute. It was one of the largest eruptions of the last 10,000 years, releasing more than 60 cubic kilometers of volcanic material, shattering the island into fragments, and sending shockwaves across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The eruption did not happen in a single moment, but in a sequence of violent stages. First came the earthquakes, tremors powerful enough to damage buildings across the Cyclades, possibly even felt in Crete itself. Then, as the volcano tore open, columns of pumice and ash rose into the stratosphere, carried by winds over the Aegean, Anatolia, and as far as Egypt. Fine ash fell across hundreds of kilometers, poisoning crops, suffocating vegetation, and contaminating water supplies. Layers of this ash, found today in ice cores from Greenland and in sediments from the Nile Delta, testify to the far-reaching scale of the event. On Thera itself, the eruption buried the town of Akrotiri beneath meters of volcanic ash. Excavations have revealed a settlement frozen in time. Multi-story houses with frescoes still on their walls, streets paved with stone, storage jars standing intact in kitchens. Unlike Pompeii, no human remains have been found, suggesting the inhabitants had time to evacuate after the initial earthquakes. But their city was sealed in a moment, preserved in extraordinary detail, a Bronze Age world encased in volcanic stone. Frescoes of ships in procession, youths carrying fish, monkeys leaping through landscapes. All survived, their colors vivid after more than 3 millennia, because of the catastrophe that destroyed them. As the eruption escalated, the most devastating force was unleashed. The collapse of the volcanic caldera sent massive tsunamis racing across the Aegean. Waves estimated at up to 30 meters in height struck the northern coast of Crete, sweeping into harbors, destroying fleets, and obliterating coastal settlements. For a civilization that depended on ships, ports, and sea trade, the impact was catastrophic. Entire fleets may have been lost in a single day, crippling the maritime networks that sustained Minoan wealth. The ports of Amnisos, Palicastro, and other coastal sites show signs of destruction consistent with such waves, though the exact correlation remains debated. What is clear is that Minoan coastal infrastructure suffered heavily in the mid-2nd millennium BCE, an aftermath that cannot be separated from the Thera eruption. The environmental consequences extended far beyond the immediate devastation. Ash clouds dimmed sunlight across the region, creating what climatologists call a volcanic winter. Shortened growing seasons, poor harvests, and famine would have followed in the years after. In Egypt, records speak of strange atmospheric phenomena, of the sun obscured, of disruptions in Nile flooding patterns. In Anatolia and the Levant, crop failures may have destabilized societies already living at the edge of subsistence. For Crete, heavily reliant on agricultural surplus to feed palace-centered redistribution, these disruptions would have struck at the heart of its economy. Trade networks fractured. Ships could no longer sail routes as reliably when ports and fleets were destroyed. Allies and partners across the Aegean faced their own crises, weakening demand and supply alike. The once thriving exchange of oil, wine, and crafted goods for metals and luxuries faltered. A civilization that had risen on the strength of maritime power suddenly found itself unable to command the same reach. Its wealth, dependent on constant movement across the sea, was cut off by forces no administration could control. The eruption also left psychological scars. For a culture so bound to ritual, with its goddess cults, sacred horns, and symbols of renewal, the violence of natural catastrophe must have shaken faith in cosmic order. Shrines on mountain peaks and in caves, sites used for centuries, may have become places of desperation, their offerings more urgent, their rituals more intense. The myths preserved centuries later, stories of divine anger, of worlds swallowed by the sea, echo the kind of memory that such an event would leave imprinted on collective consciousness. Though no Minoan text survives to record their own interpretation, the scale of the disaster ensured it was remembered, even if in transformed, mythologized form. Archaeology has provided the evidence linking this catastrophe to the decline of Minoan power. The destruction layers at several Cretan palaces, especially the second destructions around 1450 BCE, cannot be explained by the eruption alone, but the weakening it caused is undeniable. When Mycenaean influence surged in Crete after this period, with Linear B replacing Linear A and warrior culture supplanting older traditions, it was in the shadow of a civilization already fractured by natural disaster. The Thera eruption did not end Minoan society outright, but it destabilized the very foundations on which it stood, leaving it vulnerable to external domination. The preserved city of Akrotiri remains the clearest archaeological testimony to the event. Excavations begun in 1967 by Spiritan Marinatos revealed a settlement that had thrived under Minoan influence, its streets and houses showing urban planning, drainage systems, and artistry rivaling Knossos itself. Entire walls covered in frescoes reveal a society that celebrated nature, ritual, and seafaring. Ships painted in procession along harbor scenes speak of the maritime networks that had tied Thera to Crete and the wider Aegean. The eruption froze this world mid-breath, silencing it for millennia until excavation brought it back into light. Scientific studies have underscored the global reach of the eruption. Ice cores from Greenland contain layers of volcanic sulfur dated to the mid-2nd millennium BCE, consistent with the Thera event. Triering data from Europe and North America show anomalies, reduced growth patterns, linked to sudden climatic cooling. This was not a local disaster but a hemispheric one, altering climates, economies, and histories far beyond the Aegean. For Crete, the consequences were visible in the palatial record. The grand rebuilding phase of Knossos and other centers around 1700 BCE gave way to a more fragile prosperity. After the eruption, palaces show signs of stress, and by 1450 BCE most had fallen, either through destruction or abandonment. Only Knossos endured for another century, now under Mycenaean administration. The once unrivaled maritime power of the Aegean was reduced to a shadow of itself, its wealth siphoned off, its influence broken. The Thera eruption was more than an environmental event. It was a turning point in the Bronze Age. It altered trade, weakened economies, shifted balances of power, and reshaped cultural memory. The ash buried Akrotiri, the tsunamis wrecked Cretan harbors, and the skies themselves carried signs of catastrophe across the known world. The Aegean would never be the same again. After the eruption of Thera, the Minoan world did not vanish in an instant. Crete's palaces rose again, their walls rebuilt, their storerooms refilled, their courts once more echoing with ritual and administration. Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, centers of a civilization that had commanded the seas, show signs of reconstruction in the mid-16th century BCE. The Minoans proved resilient, but their strength was not what it had been. The ash, the tsunamis, and the economic shock had left fractures in a society that had thrived on agricultural surpluses and far-reaching trade. Those fractures widened in the decades that followed, opening a path for a new power rising to the north. The Mycenaeans of mainland Greece, already established in fortresses such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, watched their Cretan counterparts weaken. Their society was organized differently. Where the Minoans had priestesses and ritual centrality, the Mycenaeans were defined by kings and warriors. Their citadels, ringed with cyclopean walls, were not palaces of open courtyards but fortresses of command. They thrived on a martial ethos, celebrated in later Greek memory as the Age of Heroes. And by the middle of the 15th century BCE, they extended their power into Crete itself. The archaeological record tells the shift. Around 1450 BCE, most of the Minoan palaces were destroyed. Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, all fell in a wave of violent conflagrations. The cause has long been debated. Some argue for earthquakes, others for internal strife, but the uniformity of the destruction, concentrated across major centers, points to conflict. The timing aligns with the rise of Mycenaean dominance, suggesting that mainland forces either invaded directly or exploited Minoan weakness, installing their own administration. Knossos alone survived this wave, and its survival was not as a continuation of Minoan independence but as the seat of a new order. It is in this period that Linear B appears on Crete, the script of the Mycenaeans, adapted from the earlier Minoan Linear A. Where Linear A remains undeciphered, Linear B has revealed the administrative machinery of Mycenaean rule. Clay tablets from Knossos record allocations of grain, oil, bronze, textiles, and livestock in a language that is unmistakably early Greek. These records speak of a centralized authority managing resources with precision, and of a society increasingly focused on militarization. Chariots, armor, and weaponry are listed alongside food and ritual items. The world of priestesses and goddess cults gave way to the rule of kings and warlords. The cultural transition is evident not only in writing but in material remains. Minoan frescoes had celebrated flowing natural forms, dolphins leaping through the sea, lilies swaying in painted landscapes. After Mycenaean dominance, the imagery shifted toward rigidity and control, toward armed men and symbols of power. Tombs, too, reveal the difference. On Crete, earlier burials emphasized communal rites, but under Mycenaean influence, individual graves with rich grave goods, swords, gold, finely crafted vessels, reflect the emphasis on elite warrior identity. The political geography of the Aegean transformed with this shift. Crete, once the undisputed center of maritime power, became subordinate to the mainland. The Mycenaeans built upon Minoan networks but redirected them toward their own citadels. Egyptian records from the 15th and 14th centuries BCE begin to refer to Achaean rulers, terms that likely designate Mycenaean Greeks as significant partners in Mediterranean trade. Where once the Cretans had been intermediaries, now the Mycenaeans commanded recognition in their own right. Knossos remained the heart of this new order, its palace functioning under Mycenaean administration until around 1375 BCE. Then it too fell. Archaeological strata reveal widespread destruction across the site, a violent end to the last great center of Minoan palatial culture. After Knossos collapsed, no palace rose again on Crete. The palatial system, which had defined the island for centuries, was gone forever. The reasons for this final destruction are debated, but they fit into the wider instability of the Late Bronze Age. Internal revolt, mainland rivalries, and the sheer exhaustion of a system strained by centuries of upheaval may all have played roles. What is clear is that after 1375 BCE, Crete no longer stood as a major political or economic power. The island's population persisted, villages endured, traditions continued in art and religion, but the age of great palaces was over. Even in decline, echoes of Minoan culture survived. Mycenaean palaces on the mainland bore traces of Minoan influence in their architecture and art. Ritual practices such as bull iconography and goddess figures continued to appear, now adapted into a different cultural frame. In Homer's Odyssey, centuries later, Crete is remembered as a land of many peoples, rich in heritage. Myths of Minos, of the labyrinth, of Theseus and the Minotaur, all preserve distorted memories of the once great island civilization. The Mycenaeans had absorbed and overwritten Minoan Crete, but they could not erase it entirely. The transition from Minoan to Mycenaean dominance marks one of the clearest cultural shifts in Bronze Age Europe. The palaces rebuilt after Thera carried the weight of a society trying to sustain itself against forces too great to control. By 1450 BCE, mainland warriors had seized the advantage, and by 1375 BCE, the last flame of Minoan palatial power had been extinguished. What remained were fragments. Ceremonies remembered, art styles imitated, myths retold, echoes of a world that had once commanded the seas and shaped the imagination of later generations. The story of Atlantis begins not with ruins or inscriptions, but with words spoken in Athens in the 4th century BCE. Plato, in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, gave the world its only ancient account of a great island power lost in a single day and night. Written around 360 BCE, these texts describe a land beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, ruled by kings of immense wealth and ambition. Its capital gleamed with concentric rings of land and sea, temples plated in orichalcum, and fields overflowing with resources. Yet this glory ended suddenly, swallowed by the sea after a cataclysm of unparalleled violence. Plato's words were not presented as idle fantasy. He attributed the account to Solon, the Athenian lawgiver of the 6th century BCE, who, according to the dialogue, had heard it from Egyptian priests in Sais. These priests claimed the events had occurred 9,000 years earlier, placing the destruction of Atlantis far back in time, beyond memory, in an age when Athens itself was said to have been a virtuous and powerful city. For Plato, the contrast mattered. The disciplined, just society of ancient Athens stood against the opulence and hubris of Atlantis. The island fell because it grew corrupt, because wealth and arrogance overtook moderation and justice. The dialogues remain incomplete. Critias breaks off mid-sentence, leaving the narrative unfinished. Yet even in its fragmentary state, the account is rich with detail. The Atlanteans are described as descendants of Poseidon, their kings ruling with divine heritage, their cities ordered with precise planning, their fleets vast and formidable. They waged war against the peoples of the Mediterranean, and only Athens resisted them. In this framing, Atlantis becomes not merely a story of natural disaster, but a stage for Plato's philosophical teaching, that no matter how powerful, a society founded on greed and pride will fall. For historians and archaeologists, the question has always been whether this story drew upon real events. Plato's philosophical intent is clear, but myth and history in the ancient world often intertwined. The eruption of Thera on Santorini between 1600 and 1500 BCE is the most compelling candidate for the event behind the tale. The eruption ranks among the most powerful volcanic explosions in recorded human history. It obliterated the settlement of Akrotiri, burying it beneath pumice and ash, and sent tsunamis surging across the Aegean, striking Crete, the heart of the Minoan civilization. The archaeological evidence shows that palaces on Crete were damaged and trade networks disrupted in the decades that followed. Though the Minoans rebuilt, they never fully recovered their former dominance. Plato's description of an advanced island society undone by sudden catastrophe resonates strikingly with what is known of the Minoans. They commanded fleets, their art celebrated the sea, Their palaces at Knossos and elsewhere displayed wealth and order. The eruption of Thera did not sink Crete beneath the waves, but it destabilized a system dependent on agriculture and maritime exchange. In this sense, some scholars argue, Atlantis may not be a literal island swallowed whole, but a distorted memory of the Minoan collapse carried through centuries of oral tradition. Yet the parallels are not perfect. Plato places Atlantis in the Atlantic, far beyond the Aegean, and sets its destruction millennia before the Bronze Age. No Egyptian text survives that corroborates the tale told in Timaeus and Critias. Many scholars argue that Plato created the story himself, shaping it as allegory rather than history. To them, the coincidences with the Minoan eruption are products of later interpretation, an attempt to connect archaeology with a legend that was never intended to be factual. Still, the persistence of the Atlantis debate reflects more than idle speculation. Ancient peoples did preserve memories of disasters in mythic form. The flood stories of Mesopotamia, the Greek tale of Deucalion, and even distant echoes in other cultures show that catastrophe often leaves lasting cultural scars, retold as divine punishment or cosmic warning. It is therefore possible that Plato, even if inventing the framework of Atlantis, drew upon real traditions of destruction passed down across centuries. The site of Thera's shattered caldera, even in Plato's own day, could have suggested the ruin of a lost world. Archaeology provides a firm anchor in the ruins of Akrotiri. Excavations begun in 1967 by Spiridon Marinatos uncovered entire streets preserved in volcanic ash. Multi-story houses, vibrant frescoes, vessels still in storerooms. No bodies have been found, suggesting evacuation before the eruption, but the city itself stands as a frozen moment of Bronze Age life. Its sudden burial echoes Plato's words of an island destroyed in a single day and night. Whether he knew of these events through Egyptian sources or invented his own vision, the resemblance is difficult to ignore. The fascination with Atlantis lies also in its use as philosophy. For Plato, it was not a lost civilization to be mourned or sought, but a cautionary tale. In Timaeus and Critias, Atlantis embodies the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of forsaking virtue. The Athenians, humble and disciplined, stand as the foil to a society corrupted by luxury and conquest. The destruction of Atlantis was not merely geological, it was moral. This moral dimension ensured the story's endurance, carried forward not as history, but as symbol. Over centuries, interpretations multiplied. To some, Atlantis became a literal lost continent, a paradise drowned beneath the sea. To others, it was an allegory, never meant to be taken as fact. Renaissance thinkers, 19th century romanticists, and modern enthusiasts have projected countless theories onto Plato's fragmentary account, seeking its location in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, or even beyond. Yet all return, in the end, to the same two dialogues written in the 4th century BCE, the only foundation for the legend. What is certain is that the Minoan world and the eruption of Thera stand as real history, not allegory. They represent a society that flourished, traded, built palaces of extraordinary complexity, and then faced natural catastrophe on a scale that reshaped the Aegean. Plato's Atlantis, whether inspired by this or not, stands as a shadow of those events. A narrative that captures both the fragility of human achievement and the enduring need to understand the forces that destroy it. The words of Timaeus and Critias remain, unfinished, suspended between philosophy and memory, leaving readers to question whether Plato was preserving echoes of a lost Bronze Age world or crafting the purest of moral tales. The Minoans were gone for more than 2 millennia before their silence was broken. Their palaces had collapsed, their script forgotten, their name itself erased from memory. What survived were fragments, Greek myths of a labyrinth, a bull-headed monster, a sea king demanding tribute from Athens. These fragments were scattered across poetry and legend, echoes of something older that no one could place. For centuries, the story of the Minoans remained submerged, their world hidden beneath the soil of Crete, waiting for the moment when spades would bring it to light. That moment came at the turn of the 20th century. In 1900, Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist, began excavations at Knossos near modern-day Heraklion. Within weeks, He unearthed a palace unlike anything seen before. Vast complexes of rooms, storerooms, staircases, and courtyards spread across several acres. Frescoes emerged from the earth, vivid with color, showing dancers leaping over bulls, priestesses adorned in elaborate dresses, and landscapes alive with animals and flowers. Evans believed he had uncovered the first great civilization of Europe, centuries older than classical Greece. He gave it a name inspired by the myths of King Minos, the Minoans. The rediscovery electrified Europe. To Victorian and Edwardian audiences, the idea of a forgotten Aegean civilization preceding the glories of Athens was nothing less than revolutionary. Evans himself reconstructed parts of Knossos, pouring concrete to restore walls and columns, painting over fresco fragments to bring scenes to life. To some, this was visionary archaeology. To others, a dangerous rewriting of the past. Yet his vision stuck. The Minoans became etched in modern imagination not only as the first great Europeans, but as a kind of utopian society, peaceful, artistic, and refined, their culture free of the militarism that defined later Greek states. This idealized image was shaped as much by the spirit of Evans's time as by the ruins themselves. Europe at the dawn of the 20th century projected its own values onto the Minoans. Their frescoes, full of graceful figures and vibrant color, were read as evidence of a society where women held prominent roles and where life was dominated not by war, but by religion, ritual, and art. In the interwar years, Minoan Crete was often imagined as a paradise lost, a civilization destroyed by catastrophe and conquest, leaving behind only myths of labyrinths and sea kings. This romantic vision proved powerful, feeding not only scholarship but also national pride in Greece, which embraced the Minoans as the deep roots of its ancient heritage. Yet beneath the romanticism lay harder truths. Archaeology revealed storerooms filled with grain, oil, and luxury goods that testified to a powerful economy. Linear A, the undeciphered Minoan script, showed a system of administration complex and bureaucratic. And in later centuries, Linear B, used by the Mycenaeans on Crete after their conquest, proved that Minoan palaces were also centers of hierarchy and control. The image of a peaceful utopia gave way to a more balanced understanding. A society that wielded wealth and influence across the Aegean, but one also shaped by hierarchy, ritual power, and eventually subjugation. The myths of Greece remained intertwined with this rediscovery. The labyrinth of Knossos, where the Minotaur was said to dwell, now appeared less as fantasy and more as distorted memory. The endless corridors and staircases of the palace at Knossos seemed to echo the myth itself. King Minos, remembered as a ruler demanding tribute from Athens, became associated with the grandeur and authority of Minoan kings. These myths were not literal history, but they carried the shadow of a civilization long buried. The past had survived, disguised as legend. The Minoans also became linked in the modern age with Atlantis. After Evans's excavations, scholars and popular writers alike drew parallels between the destruction of the Minoans and Plato's account of an island empire swallowed by the sea. The eruption of Thera, with its devastation across the Aegean, seemed to many a natural candidate for the origin of the Atlantis story. Though historians remain cautious, the association has never faded. By the mid-20th century, Atlantis and the Minoans had become inseparable in popular imagination, feeding an endless stream of speculation, from academic debate to pseudo-archaeological claims. The influence of the Minoans on modern culture stretches far beyond scholarship. Their art, once entombed in ash and soil, has been reproduced countless times. Frescoes of bull leapers and dolphins adorn museums, textbooks, and even modern Greek identity. Writers, painters, and filmmakers have drawn on the Minoans as symbols of a lost golden age, a reminder of the fragility of civilizations. The legend of Atlantis, too, found new life in Renaissance thought, where thinkers like Francis Bacon reimagined it as a model for an ideal society. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Atlantis became entangled with fantasies of lost continents, from theosophy to science fiction, transforming Plato's tale into one of the most enduring myths of modernity. Archaeology, meanwhile, pressed forward. Excavations at Akrotiri on Santorini revealed a city frozen in the moment of Thera's eruption. 3-story houses, staircases, storerooms, and frescoes that rival those of Knossos in brilliance. These finds reinforce the scale and sophistication of Minoan culture, while also highlighting the catastrophe that reshaped the Aegean world. Every fresco uncovered, antelope, ships, lilies, added another fragment to the mosaic of Minoan life. Yet linear remains undeciphered, a reminder of how much is still silent. The legacy of the Minoans is not confined to history alone. They stand at the intersection of myth, archaeology, and imagination, a civilization both real and elusive. Their ruins anchor them firmly in the Bronze Age, but their memory was carried forward in myths of labyrinths and sea kings, reshaped by Plato into the parable of Atlantis, and reinterpreted by modern scholars and storytellers alike. Europe's first great civilization did not vanish completely. It returned in fragments, in myths retold, in frescoes unearthed, and in the imaginations of those who sought to understand the origins of Europe itself. Their influence endures, not only in the stones of Knossos but in the way history, myth, and longing for lost worlds continue to blur, shaping how the past is remembered and reimagined.